They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in the Sicilian underworld, it's a feast served in blood, smoke, and shattered glass. I am Alessio Marchetti, and for years, my single driving purpose was to break my greatest enemy, Lorenzo Romano. To truly destroy a man of his stature, you don't just take his life, you take his pride, his empire, and his most prized possession, his wife. Teresa Romano was supposed to be nothing more than a pawn, a beautiful, pampered trophy I could use to humiliate him and bring him to his knees before the syndicate. But when I dragged her out of the shadows of his burning compound and into the light, I didn't find the arrogant queen I expected. I found a terrifying secret, one that would shatter my hardened heart, rewrite the rules of my brutal world, and change the course of both our lives forever. The rain fell in unforgiving, torrential sheets, washing the fresh blood from the ancient cobblestones of the Romano estate and sending crimson rivers into the manicured drains. Alessio Marchetti stood like a statue in the grand foyer, his tailored dark suit soaked through, the acrid smoke from his beretta still curling into the damp, heavy night air. For 3 long years, Lorenzo Romano had been a toxic thorn in his side, a ruthless rival who fought without honor, utilizing car bombs and poison while hiding behind the veneer of legitimate business. Tonight, the games had ended. Alessio had decimated Lorenzo's compound with surgical precision. Lorenzo himself had barely escaped, fleeing like a terrified coward into the night, abandoning his loyal men and leaving his carefully constructed empire to burn to ash. But Alessio hadn't just come for territory, ledgers, or blood money. He had come for the ultimate insult, the psychological blow that would ensure Lorenzo could never show his face in Sicily again. We cleared the upper floors, boss. Matteo, Alessio's massive underboss, grunted as he descended the sweeping marble staircase. He wiped a streak of crimson from his jagged jawline, his breathing heavy. We found her, locked in the master suite. Alessio's dark, predatory eyes narrowed. Teresa Romano, the untouchable Mafia princess. Lorenzo flaunted her at every high society gala and syndicate gathering, a stunning, agonizingly silent beauty draped in millions of dollars of diamonds, the absolute envy of every don in Italy. Taking her would be the killing blow to Lorenzo's reputation. In their archaic world, a don who could not protect his own wife, his own home, was no don at all. He was prey. "Bring her down," Alessio commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that echoed off the bullet, scarred marble walls and shattered chandeliers. He braced himself. He fully expected a vicious fight. He expected a spoiled, hysterical woman, clawing at her captors, weeping for her ruined designer dresses, screaming her husband's name, and threatening them with Lorenzo's inevitable fiery wrath. Instead, as 2 of his heavily armed men escorted her down the staircase, the cavernous foyer fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Even the hardened soldiers stopped to stare. Teresa wore a simple, threadbare silk nightgown, her bare feet soundless on the freezing, debris-littered stone. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't even weeping. Her posture was rigidly straight, yet her head was deeply bowed, a curtain of long, dark hair obscuring her face. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, Alessio stepped forward, his towering, broad-shouldered frame casting a long, terrifying shadow over her fragile form. He reached out with a leather-gloved hand, his grip firm, and forcefully tilted her chin up to meet his gaze. He expected to see defiance, arrogant rage, or at the very least, paralyzing terror. Instead, staring back at him were eyes completely hollowed out by an ancient, unfathomable despair. She was undeniably beautiful, with aristocratic cheekbones and full, soft lips, but her skin was hauntingly pale, possessing the sickly translucence of porcelain. More startling than her pale skin was the faint, purplish-yellow bruise dusting her left cheekbone, clumsily covered by expensive foundation that had smeared in the chaos of the night. "Teresa Romano," Alessio said, tasting the name of his enemy on his tongue, expecting her to flinch at the sound. "Your husband left you behind." He ran. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply stared blankly at the center of his chest, her voice a fragile, broken whisper that barely carried over the sound of the rain. Are you going to kill me quickly or make it hurt? The morbid, flat question caught Alessio completely off guard. There was no fear of death in her voice, only a weary, absolute resignation to pain. It irritated him profoundly. He wanted her terrified of his power, wanted her begging for mercy so he could relish his absolute victory over Lorenzo. This numb acceptance ruined the taste of his triumph. Death is far too easy for a Romano, Alessio replied coldly, dropping his hand from her face as if burned. You're coming with me. You are property of the Marchetti family now. He turned on his heel, expecting her to stumble, to finally scream, or to resist his men. She merely followed in absolute silence, picking her way over the shattered stained glass and the fallen bodies of her husband's personal guards without a second glance. As his armored SUV drove away from the blazing, ruined compound, Alessio watched her intensely in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window at the towering flames, consuming her home, and for a fleeting, impossible second, Alessio swore he saw something resembling profound relief pass over her bruised, illuminated face. The complex puzzle of Teresa Romano had just begun. The Marchetti estate was a sprawling, impenetrable fortress nestled deep in the rolling, cypress-lined hills of Tuscany. It was a stark, elegant contrast to the gaudy, gold-leafed, ostentatious mansion of Lorenzo Romano. Alessio placed Teresa in the east wing, a lavish, sprawling suite with a private, wrought-iron balcony overlooking acres of serene vineyards. It was a beautiful, sunlit room. But make no mistake, it was a gilded cage. It was guarded around the clock by two of his most trusted men. She was his prisoner, his ultimate leverage, the bait that would eventually draw Lorenzo out of hiding. Yet, as the first agonizing week dragged on, Alessio found himself increasingly frustrated, pacing his study late into the night. Teresa was, without a doubt, the worst hostage he had ever taken, simply because she acted entirely like a ghost haunting his halls. She never demanded to make a phone call to her family. She never asked for her husband or inquired if he was alive. She barely touched the elaborate gourmet meals brought to her by the kitchen staff. When the maids came to clean her suite, she didn't issue orders. She retreated to the furthest corner of the room, her head bowed, pulling her arms around herself and making herself as physically small as possible until they left. One evening, the Tuscan sky bruised with the purple hues of twilight, Alessio found himself unable to stand the psychological mystery any longer. He unlocked her heavy oak door and stepped inside unannounced. The room was suffocatingly dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly shut against the beautiful sunset. Teresa was sitting stiffly on the edge of the massive plush bed, her hands folded perfectly and symmetrically in her lap. She wore a simple, unadorned white dress provided by his housekeeper, Elena. She looked like a marble statue in a crypt. "You haven't touched your dinner again," Alessio said, his deep voice slicing through the silence. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms and projecting overwhelming dominance. "I apologize, signor," she murmured, her voice utterly devoid of emotion, her eyes glued to the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. "I will eat if you command it." Alessio frowned deeply, pushing away from the door and stepping further into the shadowed room, his heavy footsteps muffled by the carpet. "I am not your master, I am your captor. There is a distinct difference, Teresa. Why don't you scream? Why don't you throw plates at the wall? Why don't you curse my name? Lorenzo is likely tearing the city of Palermo apart, looking for you right now, desperately trying to save his bruised ego." At the mere mention of Lorenzo's name, a violent, full-body shudder racked Teresa's fragile frame. It was the first genuine, visceral physical reaction Alessio had seen from her since the night he took her. She gripped the soft fabric of her white dress, so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bone white. "He will not look for me," she whispered, her voice trembling like a dry leaf in the wind. "I am damaged goods now, tainted. Another man has taken me from his house and locked me behind his doors. To Lorenzo, to his pride, I am already dead." Alessio stepped closer, his towering, imposing presence eating up the oxygen in the room. He wanted to shake her out of this disturbing apathy. "You're his wife," his chosen matriarch. He paraded you around like a priceless crown jewel. Jewels are cold, senor. They do not breathe, they do not speak, and they do not feel. They are kept locked away in dark, suffocating boxes and only taken out into the light to be looked at by envious men, Teresa said. For the first time, she finally raised her chin, her eyes meeting his. The sheer, crushing volume of sorrow swimming in her dark brown eyes struck Alessio like a physical blow to the sternum. It was a grief so profound, it felt contagious. You think you have cleverly stolen a queen to break a king, but you are mistaken. You have only stolen a prisoner from another warden. Alessio's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek. He was the undisputed boss of the largest syndicate in Italy. He was a man forged in violence, not prone to pity or empathy. But the profound, suffocating grief radiating from this young woman deeply unsettled his hardened soul. He noticed, not for the first time, how carefully she drew breath, how rigidly she held her torso, as if her ribs ached with every movement. He remembered the fading, ugly bruise on her cheek from the night he dragged her from the foyer. Did he hit you? Alessio asked. The question hung in the air. His voice dropped an octave, a dangerous, jagged edge bleeding into his tone. In the Marchetti family, there were strict, unbreakable codes of honor. Rivalries were settled between men. Women and children were absolutely off limits. To strike a defenseless wife was the pathetic act of a coward, a sin punishable by death. Teresa looked away, a bitter, hauntingly humorless smile touching her pale lips. Does it matter how the jewel was polished? I am your property now. Do what you came here to do, Alessio Marchetti. Use me to hurt him. Break me for your revenge. I have nothing left inside me to protect. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling violently, and reached for the top silk button of her dress, her eyes squeezing shut in awful anticipation. Stop, Alessio commanded sharply, the word cracking like a whip in the quiet room. Teresa froze instantly, her slender fingers hovering over the delicate silk buttons at her collar. She snapped her eyes open, looking at him with wide, uncomprehending panic, like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of a speeding truck. She was trembling so violently, she could barely maintain her balance on the plush rug. I don't understand, she stammered, hot, desperate tears finally spilling over her thick lashes, tracking down her pale cheeks. This is what you want. This is how you men take everything from each other. You take his territory, you burn his home, and then you take his wife. Just get it over with. A heavy, suffocating, nauseating silence descended upon the grand suite. Alessio stared at her, his sharp mind racing to process the horrific scene playing out before him. He was a ruthless man, yes. He had killed men with his bare hands, he had destroyed dynasties, and he had conquered territories with fire and lead. When he took Teresa, he fully intended to claim her as a hostage, to send a visceral message to Lorenzo that what was his now belonged solely to the Marchettis. But looking at her now, shaking like a terrified, abused child, utterly devoid of agency, dignity, or desire, his stomach violently turned in disgust. He slowly closed the distance between them, raising his hands where she could see them. Teresa squeezed her eyes shut again, her shoulders hiking up as she braced for a brutal blow, or worse, for his rough hands to tear at her clothes. Instead, Alessio reached out with agonizing slowness and gently, carefully pulled her cold, trembling hands away from her collar, folding them together in his warm palms. "Open your eyes," he said, his voice dropping the commanding bark, replacing it with a surprisingly soft, grounding timbre. She obeyed, her chest heaving, tears streaming freely down her face and dripping from her chin. "I am not Lorenzo," Alessio said, holding her terrified gaze with an intense, burning sincerity that left no room for doubt. "I am a dangerous man, and I take what I want, yes, but I do not take from those who have nothing left to give, and I do not, under any circumstances, touch terrified women." A ragged, agonizing sob broke from Teresa's lips. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. The dam, built over years of silent suffering, had finally broken. 3 years of silent, agonizing, claustrophobic suffering poured out of her in ragged, breathless, echoing gasps that tore at the silence of the room. Alessio stood awkwardly for a long moment, completely out of his depth. He was a commander of armies, not a healer of broken souls. Finally, he slowly sat beside her on the mattress, leaving a respectful distance between them. He didn't attempt to touch her or shush her, sensing that any physical contact or platitude would only terrify her more. He simply sat as a silent sentinel, waiting, letting the violent storm of her repressed emotions run its natural course. He never loved me," Teresa whispered between wet sobs, her voice thick and choked with ancient anguish. "My father owed him a massive gambling debt. Millions. I was the payment. I was only 19 years old when I was handed over to him in a back room." Alessio's massive fists clenched on his thighs until his knuckles popped. Selling daughters to settle debts was an archaic, disgusting, barbaric practice that Alessio had violently outlawed in his own territories the moment he took power years ago. "For 3 years," Teresa continued, her voice going hollow, her eyes staring blankly at the intricate patterns on the floorboards as she dissociated into the memories. "He kept me locked in that sprawling, empty house. If I spoke without his explicit permission, he beat me. If I looked at one of the guards for too long, he locked me in the dark and starved me for days. He loved to show me off at parties, dripping in diamonds, to prove to other men that he had the most beautiful possession. But behind closed doors," she swallowed hard, wrapping her arms tightly around her own torso, as if trying to hold her splintering ribs together. "He hated me. He hated women entirely. He said we were filthy. Disgusting creatures, meant only to be seen." Alessio frowned deeper, absolute confusion, mingling with a rapidly rising volcanic fury. "Teresa, what exactly are you saying?" She slowly turned her head to look at him, her tear-stained cheeks flushed with a deep, agonizing, soul-crushing shame. "I was his wife in name and legal document only. He beat me to exert dominance. He starved me to keep me weak. He systematically broke my mind. But he never touched me in that way. He was physically repulsed by the very idea of intimacy with a woman. He only wanted to own me, to cage me, not love me, not even physically." Alessio sat frozen, the colossal weight of her words crashing over him like a tidal wave. The entire Italian underworld thought Lorenzo Romano was a virile, powerful don with a gorgeous, submissive wife warming his bed every night. It was his greatest source of pride, but it was a complete and utter lie. A sick, twisted, hollow illusion built on the suffering of a teenage girl. "So," Alessio breathed, his voice barely a whisper, as the staggering realization finally hit him. "You're still a virgin." Teresa closed her eyes, bowing her head in humiliation as a single, heavy tear slipped down her jawline. "I am 22 years old. I have been married to a mafia boss for 3 years, and I have never been kissed with anything but a closed fist." That single revelation violently shattered Alessio's entire worldview and rewired the rules of his war. The strategic pawn he thought he had cleverly stolen was, in horrific fact, Lorenzo's greatest, most tragic victim. The bitter, bloody rivalry between the Marchettis and the Romanos suddenly shifted from a standard mafia war over shipping lanes and territory to a deeply personal, righteous crusade. Lorenzo wasn't just a rival boss to be defeated. He was a sadistic monster, hiding behind expensive, bespoke suits and stolen prestige. The entire dynamic in the Marchetti estate changed overnight. Alessio immediately ordered the armed guards to step back from her wing. He permanently unlocked her heavy oak door, throwing the key away. He instructed Elena, the matronly and deeply empathetic housekeeper, to clear out the closet and buy Teresa an entirely new wardrobe, not the opulent, restrictive, heavily corseted designer gowns Lorenzo forced her to wear, but soft cashmere sweaters, comfortable denim jeans, cotton sundresses, and warm, fuzzy slippers. For the first few tense days, Teresa remained highly suspicious, waiting like a beaten dog for the master's boot to drop. She stayed confined to her room, jumping at every shadow. She fully expected Alessio's sudden, jarring kindness to be an elaborate psychological trap, a cruel game designed to lower her guard before the true, devastating torture began. But the cruelty never came. The trap never sprang shut. Instead, Alessio patiently began joining her for breakfast in the bright, airy sunroom overlooking the vineyards. The first morning, they ate fresh pastries and drank espresso in complete, deafening silence. By the third morning, Alessio casually asked her about the classic literature books she had been tentatively borrowing from his study. By the second week, the thick ice cracked. Teresa offered a small, hesitant, utterly breathtaking smile when he recounted a mildly embarrassing, self-deprecating story about his towering underboss, Matteo, slipping and dropping a tray of hot espresso on himself. It was a delicate, incredibly fragile healing process, requiring more patience than Alessio had ever exercised in his violent life. He watched her slowly bloom, like a rare flower that had been kept locked in a dark cellar for far too long. He noticed the way her dark eyes practically lit up when she tasted freshly picked strawberries from the estate's garden, as if experiencing sweetness for the first time. He noticed the gentle, musical way she spoke to the estate's massive, intimidating cane corso guard dogs, beasts who turned into melting puddles of affection the moment she scratched behind their ears. And, much to his own profound surprise, Alessio noticed how his own calloused heart hammered violently against his ribs whenever she quietly walked into a room. The brutal Mafia Don was softening. He was falling, deeply and irreversibly, for the enemy's wife. One rainy evening, he found her in the estate's vast, two-story library, standing on her tiptoes, struggling in vain to reach a heavy volume on a high wooden shelf. Without a word, Alessio moved silently across the room and stepped behind her. His broad chest brushed lightly against her back as he effortlessly reached up, his long arm extending past her shoulder to pull the heavy, leather-bound volume down. Teresa gasped slightly, spinning around in surprise. They were mere inches apart, trapped in the narrow aisle between the towering bookshelves. Alessio immediately stepped back, putting his large hands up in a placating gesture of absolute surrender. "Me dispiace. I didn't mean to startle you. I should have announced myself." Teresa looked up at him, her dark, expressive eyes searching his rugged face for any sign of malice. The paralyzing, rigid fear that used to dictate her every movement was entirely gone, replaced by a cautious, budding curiosity and a strange, fluttering tension she didn't recognize. "You didn't startle me," she said softly, reaching out and taking the book from his large hands. Their fingertips brushed against each other. The sudden spark of static electricity seemed to echo loudly in the quiet, dusty room, sending a jolt up both their arms. I'm still not used to someone being standing behind me without expecting a sudden strike." Alessio's jaw immediately clenched in anger at the thought of Lorenzo's abuse. "Lorenzo will never hurt you again. I swear it on my life and the lives of my men, Teresa. You are safe in this house." She looked down at the book, her thumb absent-mindedly tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. "Am I safe from him? Or am I safe from you? From both?" Alessio vowed fiercely, his voice vibrating with absolute conviction. "I will not keep you here as a captive against your will, Teresa. The moment it is completely safe, the moment Lorenzo is dealt with permanently, I will give you a new identity, a clean passport, endless money, a house anywhere in the world you choose. You will be completely free." Teresa looked up, stunned, her breath catching in her throat. "Free? You would really just let me go, after everything you risked to take me? You were never meant to be a bird locked in a cage, no matter how gilded it is," Alessio said, his voice thick with a profound, aching emotion he had never allowed himself to feel before. He looked deeply into her eyes, laying his soul bare. "I will set you free, even if it breaks me to see you fly away." The fragile, beautiful peace they had built was violently shattered by the shrill, jarring ring of Alessio's secure, encrypted satellite phone. It was past midnight. Alessio stood on the balcony adjoining his private quarters, overlooking the darkened grounds, the cool Tuscan wind whipping at his unbuttoned shirt. He stared at the caller ID, his blood running cold, before pressing the phone to his ear. "Marchetti." Lorenzo's reedy voice slithered through the receiver like a viper, dripping with venom, desperation, and deeply wounded pride. You have something that belongs to me. Alessio gripped the iron railing so hard, the cold metal groaned under the pressure. I have absolutely nothing of yours, Lorenzo. I only have a woman you systematically tortured. You lost the right to call her your wife the very first time you laid a coward's hand on her face. A dark, cruel, genuinely psychotic laugh echoed on the other end of the line. Oh, she told you her sad, pathetic little stories, did she? She always was prone to dramatics. Listen to me, Marchetti. Keep the shipping territory. Keep the Palermo warehouses. But give me back my property. If the other families think another man is touching my wife, I look weak, and I cannot allow that insult to stand. Come and try to get her, Alessio growled, his eyes blazing with a murderous, protective intent he had never felt for territory or money. I'll bury you alive on the very edge of my property, where the dogs soil the dirt. Oh, I am coming, Alessio, right now, and I'm bringing hell with me. The line went dead with a sharp click. Alessio didn't hesitate. He immediately slammed his fist against the emergency panic button on the wall. The entire estate plunged into tactical lockdown. Deafening alarms blared. Red floodlights swept the outer perimeter walls, and dozens of heavily armed Marchetti soldiers flooded the courtyards, taking up defensive positions. The war had finally arrived at his doorstep. He sprinted down the hall to Teresa's room. Bursting through the door, she was already awake, standing barefoot by the large window, her silhouette starkly illuminated by the flashing red security lights outside. She didn't look panicked. She looked terrifyingly, unnervingly calm. He's here, she stated simply, not looking away from the window. Matteo is going to take you down to the reinforced, secure bunker hidden beneath the wine cellar, Alessio said rapidly, grabbing a heavy Kevlar tactical vest from his closet and tossing it over his broad shoulders, buckling it tight. He loaded a spare magazine into his rifle. It's bomb-proof. No matter what happens up here, no matter what you hear, you do not open that steel door until you hear my specific voice. Do you understand me, Teresa? Teresa turned and walked purposefully toward him. She didn't look anything like the broken, trembling girl he had carried out of the Romano compound weeks ago. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her chin held high with newfound dignity. He is only doing this because of his fractured pride, Teresa said, her voice impossibly steady amidst the blaring alarms. If he manages to kill you, he will take me back to Palermo. He will punish me in ways I cannot even imagine for the rest of my miserable life. He is not going to kill me, Alessio said, stepping close to her, the smell of gun oil and adrenaline radiating off him. He reached out, his large, calloused hand, gently cupping her soft cheek. This time, there was no flinching. She immediately leaned into his warm touch, closing her eyes. I promised you freedom, Teresa. I intend to walk back through that door and deliver it. Deafening gunfire suddenly erupted outside, the staccato crack of automatic weapons echoing through the hills like thunder. The first wave of Lorenzo's men had hit the reinforced steel gates. Teresa's eyes snapped open. She suddenly reached up, grabbing the heavy lapels of his tactical vest in her fists, pulling him down slightly so they were eye to eye. Her dark eyes were fiercely urgent, burning with a fire he had helped ignite. Come back to me, Alessio. Do not let that monster win. Not just for me, but for yourself. Prove that you are a better man than he could ever be. Alessio's breath hitched in his throat. In the midst of the terrifying chaos, with bullets flying outside his window, he leaned down and pressed his lips softly, reverently, against her forehead. I'll be right back. The chaotic battle for the Marchetti estate was brutal, bloody, and remarkably swift. Lorenzo, blinded by rage, had brought massive numbers, but Alessio had the high ground, a fortified position, and most importantly, men who fought out of genuine loyalty and respect, rather than the paralyzing fear Lorenzo instilled in his soldiers. The pristine courtyards and manicured gardens quickly became a chaotic, deafening symphony of bright muzzle flashes, shouting men, and shattered, flying stone. Alessio moved through the shadows of his estate with lethal, practiced precision. He wasn't just defending his criminal empire or his pride tonight. He was fiercely protecting the woman who had somehow, impossibly, become his entire world. He fought his way methodically toward the smoldering front gates, his eyes scanning the chaos, looking only for the snake himself. He finally spotted him. He found Lorenzo barking frantic, cowardly orders from behind the cover of an armored SUV. Lorenzo looked haggard, utterly desperate, his usual immaculate tailored elegance completely replaced by the frantic, dripping sweat of a cornered, pathetic animal. "Lorenzo!" Alessio roared, his voice carrying over the din of the gunfire as he stepped out from the absolute cover of a marble pillar, his assault rifle raised and locked on target. Lorenzo spun around in terror, wildly raising his own weapon, but absolute fear betrayed his aim. His hands shook violently as he fired blindly, the bullets merely chipping the stone pillar inches near Alessio's head. Alessio, cold as ice, didn't flinch. He took a breath and fired 2 perfectly controlled bursts. The first heavy round struck Lorenzo squarely in the right shoulder, spinning him around violently. The second round shattered his left kneecap with a sickening crunch. Lorenzo screamed in sheer agony, his weapon clattering away as he collapsed onto the wet, blood-stained cobblestones. The remaining Romano men, seeing their untouchable boss fall to the ground weeping, immediately broke rank. They threw down their weapons and scattered into the dark Tuscan hills, abandoning him to his fate just as callously as he had abandoned his wife weeks ago. Alessio slowly, deliberately walked up to the writhing, sobbing man. He kicked the dropped gun far out of Lorenzo's reaching hand, looking down at his enemy with absolute disgust. "You're a dead man, Marchetti," Lorenzo spat, blood bubbling on his pale lips, clutching his shattered knee. "The Syndicate Commission won't stand for this disrespect. You stole my wife. You completely humiliated me in front of the families." "You humiliated yourself," Alessio said, his voice eerily, terrifyingly calm. He looked down at the pathetic, whining creature bleeding out on his driveway. He thought of the yellowish bruises on Teresa's delicate skin. He thought of the 3 years of psychological torture and starvation she had endured in absolute, terrifying silence while this man drank champagne with other bosses. Every single ingrained instinct in Alessio's mafia-bred soul screamed at him to pull the trigger, to empty the rest of his heavy magazine into Lorenzo's skull and end the rivalry forever. It would be so incredibly easy. In their world, it would be entirely justified. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, he vividly remembered Teresa's fierce words in the bedroom. "You are a better man than he could ever be." If he executed Lorenzo here, like a rabid dog bleeding in the dirt, he was playing entirely by the old, bloody, endless rules of their dark world. He would be just another ruthless, irredeemable killer perpetuating a cycle of violence. He wanted desperately to be the noble man Teresa believed he was capable of being. With immense effort, Alessio lowered his rifle. He looked over at Matteo, who had rushed up beside him, his gun drawn and ready to finish the job. "Patch him up, Matteo. Just enough so he survives the long trip," Alessio ordered coldly, never taking his eyes off Lorenzo. "Then throw him in the trunk and dump him directly at the marble steps of the Syndicate Commission in Palermo, along with every single hidden financial ledger we seized from his compound. Let the Don see exactly how he skimmed their hard-earned money, and let them judge a pathetic man who beats his own defenseless wife, but cowers and weeps in a real firefight. He's finished in this life." Lorenzo's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic, ignoring the pain in his leg. In their twisted society, to be formally judged by the commission as a petty thief and a coward was a fate infinitely worse than a quick bullet. It meant total, humiliating exile. It meant his name would be erased from history, an absolute disgrace. "No, Alessio, please, just kill me. Shoot me. Do it." Alessio turned his back on the screaming man, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and walking back toward the mansion. "I told you on the first night, Lorenzo, death is far too easy." The sky was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple, the sun peeking over the rolling Tuscan hills and casting a warm, golden, hopeful glow over the battle-scarred estate, when Alessio finally descended the concrete stairs to the underground bunker. He was utterly exhausted, his muscles aching, covered in dark soot, dust, and drying blood, but his heavy heart felt lighter than it had in a decade. He punched in the code, and slowly opened the heavy steel door. Teresa was sitting huddled on a small military cot, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with anxiety. When she saw him standing in the doorway, breathing heavily but alive, she scrambled to her feet, practically flying across the concrete room. She didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She threw her arms tightly around his thick neck, burying her face deep into his chest, inhaling the scent of smoke and survival. Alessio let out a long, shuddering breath he didn't know he was holding. He wrapped his strong, bloodied arms tightly around her slender waist, lifting her entirely off the floor, holding her as if she were the only real thing left in the world. "It's over," he whispered fiercely into her dark hair, kissing the crown of her head. "He's gone, Teresa. The commission has him now. He will never, ever hurt you again." Teresa pulled back slightly, her small hands resting flat against his Kevlar-covered chest, feeling the steady, incredibly reassuring, thumping beat of his heart beneath the armor. "And you? Are you hurt? Tell me the truth." "Only my pride, knowing a brave woman had to tell me how to be a better man." Alessio smiled softly, his large thumb reaching up to brush a stray tear of pure relief from her cheek. Later that week, true to his solemn vow, Alessio asked Teresa to join him outside. They were standing on the sun-drenched balcony, overlooking the endless rows of vineyards. Alessio reached into his jacket and handed Teresa a thick, heavy manila envelope. Inside is a brand new passport, a secure bank account in Switzerland loaded with enough untraceable money to live 10 lavish lifetimes, and the official deed to a beautiful, secluded villa in the south of France, Alessio said, his voice incredibly tight, his throat constricting as he forcefully refused to look her in the eye. "You are completely free, Teresa. The car is idling downstairs to take you to the private airstrip." Teresa took the heavy envelope. She slowly opened the flap and looked at the crisp, forged documents inside, her delicate fingers tracing the fake name that promised her absolute anonymity, safety, and a fresh start. She had dreamed of exactly this moment in the dark for 3 agonizing years. She had prayed to God for a way out. She looked back at Alessio. He was staring rigidly out at the distant horizon, his jaw locked tight, his large hands gripping the balcony railing until his knuckles were white, silently bracing his soul for the immense pain of watching her walk away. He was a terrifying, legendary mafia boss to the outside world, but to her, he was the only man who had ever stopped when she said no. He was the man who had patiently given her back her stolen voice, who had fought an entire army to protect her, and who was now selflessly giving up his own chance at happiness just to ensure she could fly free. Slowly, deliberately, Teresa pulled the documents from the envelope and tore them cleanly in half. Alessio's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes wide with utter shock as the torn pieces of paper fluttered playfully over the stone balcony railing, disappearing forever into the warm Tuscan wind. "Teresa, what in God's name are you doing?" he asked, stunned. "I have spent my entire miserable life being strictly told where to go, how to dress, and who to belong to," Teresa said, taking a bold step forward, entering his personal space, her dark gaze locked fiercely with his. "My own father sold me like cattle. Lorenzo imprisoned me like a trophy. If I take that plane and leave now, I am just running away from my past. I want to finally make a choice, my very own choice." She reached up, her soft hands tangling gently and possessively in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "I am choosing to stay right here," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with an overwhelming, profound emotion she was finally ready to name. "I am choosing you, Alessio." Alessio let out a ragged, disbelieving breath. He abandoned his grip on the railing and wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He looked deep into her beautiful eyes, seeing the undeniable, awe-inspiring strength and fire that had miraculously survived the darkest of abuses. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked, his voice raw, giving her one last chance to run. "My world is violent. It is not a gentle one, Teresa. It is perfectly gentle when I am with you," she replied, a brilliant smile finally breaking across her face. For the first time in her 22 years of life, Teresa closed her eyes and leaned in, offering her lips not out of terrible obligation, duty, or fear, but out of profound, undeniable, consuming love. When Alessio kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a conqueror. It was soft, deeply reverent, and full of a solid promise for a new dawn. He had stolen the enemy's wife to win a petty, bloody war, but he had ended up finding his true queen, and together, they would burn the old rules down and build a legacy not on fear, but on absolute truth, unyielding resilience, and profound respect. If this immersive story of surviving the absolute darkest of worlds, finding incredible dignity in the bitter ashes of abuse, and the unexpected, powerful redemption of a ruthless mafia boss moved you, please hit that like button. Share Teresa's inspiring journey of resilience and Alessio's transformation with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more cinematic audio dramas and intense fictional stories just like this one. Let us know in the comments below. Do you think Alessio truly redeemed his violent past by saving her? Or was his love just another, more complicated form of mafia possession? We love reading your in-depth thoughts and theories. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a gripping tale of love, betrayal, and vengeance. Until next time, stay strong, protect the ones you love, and keep seeking the truth.